Good afternoon. I'm Andy Cantrell, and today we'll be discussing the social penetration theory. The social penetration theory was developed by Altman and Taylor in 1973, and what they were looking at was the idea of relational closeness. They wanted to determine how relationships develop over a period of time. And what they found was that there was this gradual development that occur within relationships from a superficial level to a more intimate level, and that intimacy that eventually occurs in some relationships actually develops through self-disclosure. Now, what self-disclosure is the voluntary sharing of information with others. And like I said earlier, relationships go from being superficial kinds of relationships, maybe those that you have with people that you meet at the supermarket, or maybe the barista at the Starbucks that you get your coffee from every morning. But it begins with kind of superficial, where you know basic information about one another, and progressively gets more intimate. And it's rapid at the beginning. This process of self-disclosing and sharing ideas is rapid at the beginning, but as we get into more intimate details of our lives, that begins to slow down significantly. High levels of disclosure, we all have those situations in which people maybe overshare information before we really get to know them too well. And those high levels of disclosure too early in relationships can actually be detrimental to the relationship and cause it to stall. Now, in self-disclosure, one of the things that Altman and Taylor addressed was the idea of breadth and depth. And breadth basically refers to the range of topics that you may disclose with others, where depth refers to the level of intimacy of the information that you're disclosing. And Altman and Taylor found that both of those things were equally important in the development of the relationship. Now, when determining what information to self-disclose, what they found was that there was this cost versus reward relationship that occurs. And basically, a reward, an example of a reward would be that the relationship just grows closer. An example of a cost may be that you would lose face, or maybe you would have information that you shared with someone that then they share and pass that information along that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have shared with other people. So what individuals have to do when deciding whether to self-disclose is to look at the perceived reward and determine whether it outweighs the perceived cost of self-disclosing. The onion metaphor is often used to describe the layers and the degree of intimacy that we self-disclose. And it looks at just the multiple layers of our personality, and that we have multiple layers to our personalities, just like there's multiple layers to an onion. And the outermost layer of our personality represents public information that's viewable by anyone. That's our height, our weight, those types of things. Then as we begin to move closer into the core, the layers begin to contain more intimate information. And those things include our attitudes, our beliefs, emotions. Now, what Altman and Taylor also found is that there are several stages of relational development. The first stage is the orientation of interaction stage, and this is where we only disclose that very public information. Maybe information like our names, where we work, where we went to school, those types of things. And then it moves into more intimate information like maybe our spouses, maybe where we live, and it goes to the exploratory affect exchange stage, and then to the affective stage, and finally to the stable exchange stage. And that's the stage in which we share the most intimate information, and it's also the stage in which we begin to have a degree of intimacy with the other relational partner that we can begin to predict each other's actions and responses. And the stable exchange, this is where we would find relationships like marriages or family relationships, those types of things. A couple of the research studies that have been done in regards to social penetration are this Dara and Benny Chiody's study, in which they wanted to look at the relationship between self-disclosure and interpersonal attraction. And their hypothesis was that individuals are just simply more attracted to people that are similar to themselves. And so what they did was they studied 87 college-age males. They were between the ages of 18 and 22, and they began to look at their relationships, and what they found was that there was a positive correlation of attraction and similarity based on the content of the information that was shared, as well as a positive correlation of attraction and similarity based on the disclosure level, so the degree of intimacy of the information that they shared. Honeycutt also did a study from a social penetration perspective, in which he looked at this model of marital function and how attraction and social penetration affect marital functioning. And so he had some penetration variables that he was measuring, and these were things like openness, attentiveness, expressiveness, and he was also looking at agreement levels. So he would have statements like, my spouse and I are very similar in our attitudes and beliefs, and the subjects of this study would have to, on a scale, rate where they thought that their relationship fell. What they found through this study was that openness was the most important variable, and interestingly, flexibility was the least important variable. And the results then ultimately showed that perceived partner understanding and similarities enhance marital functioning. Yang, Brown, and Braun then began to take the study of social penetration and apply it to more modern type of things. And what they wanted to do was to examine technology and its role in relationship development. And what they found through their studies is that there's a sequence of media use tied to states of relational development. So what they found was that in the initial stages, when we're kind of in those outer layers, and in the beginning stages of development, like the orientation stage, college students had a tendency to use Facebook for those kinds of early interactions. And then as they moved into the deeper layers of development, then they proceeded to use more intimate forms of communication, like instant messaging, and then eventually it got to the point of using cell phones and calling one another and physically speaking on the phone. What Yang, Brown, and Braun found also that I thought was interesting is that females have a tendency to use technology for more social interaction, where males tended to use the technology for maybe setting up study sessions with others, or maybe sending documents to one another, and they used it more for school-related academic purposes rather than social interaction kind of purposes. Now, there are several strengths to the social penetration theory, and the first is that it's just simply a valuable tool for us to be able to describe and understand the way in which relationships develop. And it also provides us an understanding of why, in those situations when people overshare too early in the relationship, that we feel uncomfortable. And finally, one of the strengths of the social penetration theory is that it really shows the importance of communication in developing relationships with others. Some of the weaknesses, on the other hand, of the theory are that some people just simply believe that the theory is too simplistic. They think that the theory doesn't really take into account the context or the situation in which the interaction between two people occur, and they also think that there are no gender issues that are taken into consideration. And we know from other studies that males have a tendency to disclose less than females. And the social penetration theory really doesn't take gender into consideration. It also assumes that the goal of all relationships is to become highly intimate relationships. And that's just not the case. I used the example of your barista at Starbucks the other day, and chances are you're probably not going to have a deep relationship with that person that you see maybe for 5 minutes each morning and kind of exchange hellos with, and just general type conversation. And then finally, most of the research that's been conducted regarding social interaction or social penetration theory involves face-to-face interaction and doesn't really address other forms of communication, such as technology, as I discussed a little bit earlier. There are lots of research studies beginning to take place that are addressing technology and its role in relational development, but it's still in its early stages and has a long way to go. So hopefully that tells you a little bit about the social penetration theory and gives you a little bit of insight into what the theory is about and the types of research that are occurring with it. So thank you for listening and have a great day.